for joining us here at Insight for Good. We are a research and consultancy firm dedicated to supporting organizations achieve their social goals through evidence and insight. Much of our work is linked with the Sustainable Development Goals, also called the SDGs, and they involve issues related to climate change and responsible consumption. So we are here to interview Professor Randall Abate. Thank you, Professor, to join us.
Thank you for having me.
So Randall Abate is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Sociology at Monmouth University in New Jersey. He teaches courses in domestic and international environmental law, climate justice, constitutional law, and animal law. Professor Abate joined the Monmouth faculty in 2018 with 24 years of full-time teaching experience. He has delivered lectures in many different countries around the world. Besides his extensive teaching experience, Professor Abate has published 6 books and more than 30 law journal articles. He's the author of 2 recently published books, Climate Change and the Voiceless, published in 2019, and What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law, published in 2020. So, Professor, to start with, we'd like to talk about the different fields that you have taught and what were the triggers related to switching your academic focus over the years. So we understand you've worked on environmental law, animal law, and international climate change. So what were the triggers to switch your focus?
Certainly, the initial trigger was my pursuit of environmental law as a career path, and chose Vermont Law School for that reason. They're well known for their environmental law focus, and that was really inspired by my childhood growing up in New England. Always had a passion for the outdoors, hiking, camping, just a reverence for the natural world, and an interest in wanting to play a role in protecting the natural world for the future. The transition to international law and climate change law came later in my career. It was after a decade of teaching environmental law, and primarily U.S. environmental law, and writing on those issues. So I had an opportunity to teach international environmental law in Nairobi, Kenya, in a study abroad program in 1998. And that really propelled me into an interest and passion for international environmental law issues, which very shortly thereafter focused on climate change. Every time I taught international environmental law, climate change was a bigger part of the course. And so from there, I really transitioned into focusing more on the justice aspects of climate change. The climate justice field was taking off, and this notion of human rights and the environment shifting from more of a pollution control focus to more of a human rights-based focus. And very late in my career, in 2014, I taught animal law for the first time. And it was a natural transition from those 2 initial steps, because it drew on a lot of what I already knew about protection of wildlife from environmental courses and study. But it also drew on my experience teaching tort law and constitutional law at the law school level, because there's much of those fields involved in animal law as a field of inquiry. So it was a very good fit for where I was in my career, and I certainly have always had a passion for protecting animals as part of the environmental domain. That was a focus of my career.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. So we are very interested in your 2 recently published books, Climate Change and the Voiceless. Let's start there. So who are the voiceless?
So for purposes of my book, the voiceless are those 3 entities that are reflected in the subtitle of the book. So it's future generations of humans, and that would include current youth and the unborn. And there are 2 other domains in the non-human world, wildlife and natural resources. So it's these 3 categories for purposes of my book that constitute the voiceless. And by voiceless, I'm referring to the fact that they lack their own voice in the legal system. They require representatives, human representatives, adult human representatives, to advocate on their behalf. They aren't recognized as having the opportunity to participate fully in the process, political process, legal process, the way adult humans are. Other references to the voiceless occur in the legal domain. Sometimes it's used to refer to just marginalized communities in some capacity, but the book only focuses on these three categories of the voiceless.
Okay, you have raised very interesting segments that hardly exist, or they don't exist yet, or they can't share their voices, their feelings, their thoughts. And I'd like to understand how you've used those three segments to think that there would be policies that would be required to consider their voices. So what policies are required to consider their voices when they're not existing yet?
Well, one example I'll give on that, I mean, the book is focused very much on making policy and legal recommendations in this regard, and they're quite extensive, but to encapsulate it, the idea of what is necessary for better protection of the voiceless is really in two parts. First is the notion of enhanced government stewardship of these voiceless entities. So the idea is that to the extent that the legal system doesn't provide them with adequate protections, one way to protect them more fully is for the government to do a better job in looking out for their interests. And so the other piece to that, though, is that we don't want to put all of our eggs into that basket and assume the government is just going to maintain that, fulfill that higher level of stewardship. It has to be paired with rights-based protections. So if the government fails in fulfilling those higher stewardship duties, there would be a right that these voiceless entities would have to hold them accountable, hold the government accountable for its failure to act or its acting insufficiently on a given matter. So that came up in several different contexts in climate justice litigation. And one of the most prominent cases is a case in the US called the Juliana case. And it was brought by youth plaintiffs who were not of age to vote, and ultimately were using the courts as a way to make these two arguments, ultimately asking for the government to regulate climate change when it had chosen not to, and how the government had this duty to do that, to engage in that regulation on behalf of future generations. And secondly, how the plaintiffs made an argument that there was a constitutional right to a stable climate. So they were alleging this rights-based protection through our due process clause in the US Constitution to say that what good are the other liberties that our Constitution recognizes if these youth plaintiffs don't have a constitutionally protected right to a stable climate, that this is part of what enables them to make this argument for the government to do a better job of protecting their interests and ensure a more sustainable future.
That's great. Thank you. And in your book, you talk about the principles of sustainable development to mitigate climate change. Could you tell us more about them?
Yes, so the book's proposal is very much linked to an understanding of how sustainable development ought to proceed moving forward. So sustainable development has been around as a term of art really since the late 1980s, and it has been integrated into much of our environmental policy. The problem, though, is that it is typically an aspirational reference point for how environmental laws are implemented. So an example would be in the US, the National Environmental Policy Act. It's really grounded in this notion of sustainable development. It requires federal agencies to consider the impacts to the environment that its major projects might entail before they proceed with those projects. But the problem is that under the terms of the law, there's no enforcement mechanism, that ultimately once the agencies have considered those impacts and detailed them in an environmental impact statement, they can go ahead and proceed with the project anyway. And so the proposal in my book with respect to sustainable development is that it needs to be a binding mandate, that ultimately all of our decisions, whether it be federal government or in the private sector, really need to be held to a sustainable development lens that would, in fact, deny projects from moving forward if we apply some kind of standard that determines these projects to be unsustainable. And there are many different ways that we can establish what sustainable means from context to context. So one example is with respect to climate change, how a project might have an impact, an undue impact on climate change would be to say, climate science has established carbon budgets for each political entity, geographically speaking, whether it be a nation or a state within a nation. And the idea is that if a proposed project would exceed a particular carbon budget, that is what a country or a state can emit and stay within our overall goals for climate change, if those projects exceed those limits, that should be deemed unsustainable and rejected.
And how do you think that these principles will be effective or be listened to at this point in the United States, for example?
Well, there's been some encouraging developments in the courts in this regard. So one example, a very prominent one from Australia in early 2019, involved a case where there was a massive proposed coal mine. And like in the US, in Australia, most of these projects are just rubber stamped because they're good for the economy. They always proceed regardless of their impact on the environment. And in that case, a very forward-looking judge ultimately concluded that, in part, this proposed coal mine needed to be rejected on the basis of how much of a significant contribution it would have on climate change, and therefore cause the country to exceed its carbon budget, and rejected the proposal on that basis.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Professor. And now moving on to your latest book, What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law? So in your book, you talk about the need for animal law and environmental law to collaborate more. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes, so when I started to write this book in 2014 and teach that course for the first time, a course in animal law, what I was noticing, and to my surprise, was that these two fields have more in common than they seem to admit. And I saw many of the same challenges that these fields faced, environmental law certainly being the senior of the two fields. So environmental law had encountered challenges 20, 30 years ago that animal law is encountering now in many ways. And also the kinds of strategies that the two fields needed to use to achieve gains in their fields were quite similar. And so in that way, and the fact that many of their goals overlap in terms of this idea of environmental protection involves protection of ecosystems, which includes protection of wildlife, and animal law is concerned about protection of wildlife. It was surprising to me that there wasn't more collaboration between the two fields.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can understand that. And why do you think it didn't really occur, this collaboration?
I think in part it's because the two fields think of themselves differently. So environmental law was very much driven, and still is driven, by science, and very much by avoiding impacts to human health and welfare. So if we think back to the 1970s in the US, many of our federal environmental laws that were very successful in regulating the environment were driven by a need to protect human health and safety. So whether we talk about air pollution, water pollution, land-based pollution of hazardous waste, all of these pollution threats were threats to human health and welfare. And that made it easy to garner the political will to regulate those problems. When we think about animal law, it's very much driven by a moral imperative that we ought to do a better job to protect non-humans, because it's the right thing to do, not because it's necessarily in humans' interest to do so. And so the two fields kind of have a different frame of reference in how they go about their business, and that is certainly how they perceive each other to be different. Even though they're very much aligned in other ways, that difference in approach, I think, separated the fields and avoided opportunities for collaboration. And I think the second reason is that they just weren't seeking each other out to collaborate. They just didn't capitalize on opportunities to collaborate as they should. And one example is the Endangered Species Act. I mean, it's very much an environmental law, but it's also a law that is about protecting animals.
That's right. That's right. Okay, and I've also seen in interviews that you talk about international law and how it is an aspiration for society to be able to, for it to be an integrated field that where different countries can actually act upon and develop policies from. What do you think are the barriers for lack of agreement and therefore progress in this space of international climate change law?
Well, there's been a massive failing, I think, when it comes to international consensus on climate change, and that's been a huge disappointment to me as I've worked in this field for 2 decades now. And I think that one thing about international law that is an incomplete remedy for the problem of climate change is that international law doesn't come with binding enforcement mechanisms the way we see with domestic law. So much of it is an agreement among countries to agree that they will implement mandates back home. So there is no international enforcement body if those countries fail to fulfill their obligations. And so what happened with climate change law is that to effectively regulate climate change, it requires a lot of economic sacrifice. And whether you're a developed country or a developing country, economic priorities often take priority. They're more immediate needs. And it's more understandable in the developing world. I mean, they need to put the socioeconomic priorities first before something of a long-term nature, environmental problem like climate change. But the other challenge is ultimately, this is a global threat, like we saw with stratospheric ozone depletion. Stratospheric ozone depletion in the 1980s was a threat to humanity in very much the way that climate change is now.
Yes.
And the idea is that that was a major success as a global environmental response for a few reasons. First is that it was a very narrow, identifiable scientific challenge, that there was something that science could conclusively point to, that we see the emission of chlorofluorocarbons causing depletion of our ozone layer. So what we need to do is phase out that chemical in a very small sector of our economy and come up with an alternative that provides the benefits that chemical does, refrigeration, air conditioning, and transition to an ozone-friendly version of that chemical, which we did. So that was, in the grand scheme of things, it was very affordable. Whereas if you look at climate change, first of all, there's been a lot of doubt about the science, unjustifiably so, climate denial science. So we don't have that clear consensus about what we need to do to regulate the problem. And then we also have the economic dimension, which is it's incredibly costly because climate change affects all sectors of the economy, whereas with ozone depletion, it was just a very small sector. And so you also see a problem of lack of political will in major developed countries on this issue. So the US was a leader in addressing stratospheric ozone depletion, and it's been a laggard when it comes to climate change regulation. The US has been a big part of the problem, not taking the leadership role that it should. And that was true of other major industrialized nations like Australia and Canada, just were not taking the leadership role on this kind of a challenge the way they should have.
In your opinion, do you think it'll take long, or how long do you think it'll take for the human species to be ready to collaborate internationally, to be able to work together to combat climate change? And will we ever?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pragmatist on that note, and I think that I don't really trust human nature to do the right thing in time, and I think that I'm more hopeful about aggressive responses at the regional and national level. I mean, it's a global problem, so we have to have global dialogue about it. But I'm very skeptical after looking at climate negotiations for the past 3 decades, very skeptical about a genuine global solution that will be enforceable. We've seen various versions of responses that were incomplete and not fully effective, the Kyoto Protocol, and then the Paris Agreement. And all of these approaches have made some progress. They've avoided allowing the problem to be worse. But in terms of meaningful progress toward where we need to be and within a very emergency-based time frame, it's not getting us there. And so we really need to rely on those effective, geographically narrower responses. And at the national level, that's where I think a lot of progress is being made. And a lot of this climate justice litigation brought by youth plaintiffs is forcing governments to be more aggressive within their own territories.
That is a very interesting approach, and it's about, as you say, it's about the human beings won't necessarily act until it impacts them. Yes. In their own, in their region, in their with their social circles. And this brings us a bit to thinking about the current COVID-19 pandemic, because we've all lived it, and it does relate partly with the current environmental challenges that we're living today. Many experts indicate that normality is what has caused it in the first place. So that the new normal requires that human beings go back to more natural ways of living, whereby we prioritize local consumption, eliminate animal farming, among other changes. Do you think that the pandemic was preventable from a policy and legislation perspective?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic and climate change have a lot in common. Both of them are long-term, slow onset problems that are very difficult for humans to regulate effectively because we tend to look at short-term economic gain and not these long-term, slow onset threats. It's just a function of human nature. It's why we procrastinate when we have a deadline and do very much of the work at the very end of the process when we have to do it, and not months in advance. So I think that with the pandemic, this wasn't a surprise that we would have a zoonotic disease pandemic. We've seen them before. We're going to see them again. And ultimately, our refusal to transition away from our exploitation of animals is what got us into this problem. And the illegal wildlife trade, another piece of that. So that is very much connected to our problem with climate change as well. It's our speciesist approach to the natural world, that the environment and the animals within it are really there for our consumption and our economic gain, and they're just going to be this unlimited bounty for us to harvest without any kind of repercussions. And that's, of course, been a huge problem on both accounts, that when you exploit the natural world to that level, it will bite back in a very serious way. And we're seeing that with climate change and with the pandemic.
That's right. And did you mention before your studies and the linkages between animal law, environmental law, international climate change, with also the field of human rights? And I'm wondering whether this link, you feel that it has been made clearer as a result of the pandemic, because it has impacted specific groups of people, including farmers and agriculture workers who work in these factories and quite scary animal factories, effectively. Could you tell us more about those linkages?
Yes, I think that's where environmental law was able to make its impact again in the 1970s in the US. It was that connection to human concerns that ultimately motivated us to do a better job protecting the environment. And we're seeing that again with COVID and its impacts during this pandemic, that it is a significant human rights problem, and that is drawing more attention to the need to address it effectively than if it were merely a generic kind of threat to the environment without impacts to human health. So because it's such a significant impact to human health, because it has significant economic consequences, and because it is a justice problem, it's disproportionately impacting marginalized communities. We're seeing much higher incidence of COVID disease among minority populations in the U.S., and we're certainly seeing those workers in factory farms, as you've noted, put in harm's way in a way that is just creating very much of a backlash politically as to this is an inappropriate reality from a social justice perspective. So,
Yeah.
that helps the problem get more attention than it would otherwise.
Yes, absolutely. And throughout your academic journey, what was it like to realize that ultimately many of our social and environmental issues relate to people and human behavior?
Yeah, I think that was a big awakening for me in the late 1990s. So the field of environmental justice came about in the U.S. probably in the late 80s, and that field essentially represents this notion of environmental protection isn't just about science and resources; it's about people. And so that field drew attention to the fact that environmental pollution problems are not evenly distributed in our communities, that minority communities and low-income communities were bearing a disproportionate burden of our environmental problems as compared to wealthier communities and white affluent communities. And so that was something that traced also into my study of international environmental law, how at a global level we're seeing these disproportionate burdens in the developing world as opposed to in developed countries. And so environmental justice really took this global perspective, and when the climate change negotiations were going on, there was a big debate about how much of a duty the developed world owed to the developing world to help them adapt to climate change, because the developed world was largely responsible for the brunt of those impacts. And so it was very much of a human social justice framing of what initially seemed to be an environmental problem.
And throughout your career, have you engaged with behavioral experts in order to influence the development of policy in your areas of study?
It's only been a development as of late, very much when I transitioned into animal law, and that I started thinking more about climate change and why there had been such an ineffective response. I have a background in psychology at the undergraduate level, and I was always interested in human nature and what motivated humans to respond or not respond to certain problems. And there's now a lot of literature on this with respect to climate change, how human nature is just fundamentally defective in addressing these long-term slow onset problems. That we just, in part because we're afraid of the consequences, we just don't want to think about impending disaster if we can get through the next week or next year and be fine. And ultimately, it's a challenge for both environmental law and animal law in the sense that we can address these problems if we break them down into individual daily action and try to have some control over the problem. Because one reason why we don't respond effectively is that we think it's a problem that's spiraled out of control and we're helpless. So both fields have taken more of a demand reduction approach to the problems, and that seems to work more effectively. So in the climate change domain, we see fossil fuel divestment efforts, something you can do at a very individual local level to request entities to divest from their support from the fossil fuel industry and their portfolios, their financial portfolios. And likewise, at the animal law level, it's about food choices, that you really do have capacity as a consumer to do the right thing for animals and for the environment and for your health all at the same time by making plant-based choices as opposed to traditional factory farm produced meats.
Yes, well, that's great. So just to summarize and link your thinking with ours as well, we, as you know, well, as Insight for Good, we focus on understanding behavior to support social goals. And we do this often with the application of the behavioral sciences. For example, using nudges, so things such as specific triggers that can help change behavior. A quick example can be seen in the introduction of the 5p plastic bag charge in the UK, which led to an 85% reduction of disposable plastic bag use in England in the first 6 months. And what behavioral sciences would say is that actually it wasn't necessarily the introduction of the 5p charge, which relates to loss aversion, a behavioral concept, but the fact that the policy change normalized the use of disposable plastic bags. So, just with the fact that people would see other people using it meant that people started to accept it. So have you used this kind of nudges, or have you related to people expert in these fields to develop policy or particular solutions that can shape environmental law, animal law in practice?
Yes, absolutely. I think humans respond to two motivations. One is economic, and the other is social acceptance. So we're seeing both of those developments in these domains. I think with respect to the economic incentives, government needs to play a better role, and there needs to be advocacy for governments to play the role it can in incentivizing good choices and punishing bad choices. So an example there would just be through simple taxation. Um, there in the U.S. there was a tax break offered for individuals who bought hybrid vehicles as opposed to traditional gas-powered vehicles, and likewise there has been discussion about a carbon tax on beef, where you can still choose to eat beef if you like the product, but in much the way that tobacco was heavily taxed because it was socially ostracized in many ways once it was perceived as a public health threat. The same may be on the writing may be on the wall for beef as well, in the sense that it is a major threat to animal welfare, to the environment, to public health, and imposing a tax on that choice may reduce the demand, and the government can engineer that preference away from the product in that way. But we can also do it ourselves in the private sector. So in London, a university was the first to ban beef from its cafeteria and last year, and that's another example of we don't have to wait for the government to do it for us. We can take initiatives at a much smaller scale to drive demand in a certain way toward a goal. And I think we're also seeing something like that in Europe in this development with flight shaming, that taking flights when you can be taking lower impact ways of transportation across Europe
Yeah,
is something that is socially condemned in many ways because it's not good in this era of climate change. If you can take a train, you should, rather than take a plane. It's a much lower impact on the environment. And so there are ways that the flight shaming initiative may ultimately lead to beef shaming as another social movement, if you will, to nudge society toward better choices that are good for us all.
exactly. Well, and finally, our last question. Where do you think that the fields of study that you're involved with, environmental law, animal law, international climate change law, human rights, where do you think they might evolve or merge or converge into even other new fields in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, there's some really interesting developments happening right now, and I think one is with respect to science and technology and how that's very much an important tool to shape our future. So if you look at it, whether we look at it from climate change or from animal and food law, we see that science and technology could rescue us from a lot of these problems we're seeing, but it comes with trade-offs. So on the climate change domain, there's a lot of discussion about geoengineering. So this is that kind of science and technology fix for the climate change problem, essentially deliberately tinkering with the atmosphere at a global level such that we can cause the planet to cool and ultimately protect ourselves from severe impacts from climate change. But it comes with all kinds of known and unknown risks about how it could go wrong. And it, again, could further marginalize developing countries and their reliance on certain patterns of how they live. So one would be the monsoons may be altered if we tinker with the atmosphere at that planetary level. And then in the animal and food domain, we're seeing a shift toward plant-based initiatives, and also a new sector of clean meat. So lab-grown meat that would use animal cells but would not have the environmental or animal welfare impact of traditional factory farmed meat. So that would be very good for animals, for the environment, for public health. But ultimately, there's trade-offs involved there. It's a very energy-intensive process. Lab-grown meat still does involve some killing of animals to extract the cells to grow the meat. So it's not a perfect solution. So there's very much of an initiative to go toward plant-based. And there's a lot of challenges, bumps in that road to transition, and that we're now seeing the traditional meat industry fight back against these plant-based initiatives, how they are seeking to assert their control over the terms meat and milk, and are filing legal actions against plant-based companies for use of the term meat and milk, because they're saying only animal-derived meat and milk are the limit of what those terms mean. So you can't say things like almond milk or plant-based meat. It's something that needs to be identified differently, and they've lost those lawsuits by and large. That it's just been bullying on the part of the meat and dairy industry to exclude plant-based meat and milk from the market. And so that's been an exciting change in the process that's very relevant to both the environment and protection of animals and protection of human health.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that was a great interview from our side. So thank you so much for spending time with us. And we really look forward to continue conversations in future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilma. Really enjoyed it.
Okay.